Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubinstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Hi, this is Camille. Welcome to Restoring the Culture. Today, Tanya and I will be talking about restoring the digital culture. And I'd like to start off with a quote from the book Everyday Ubuntu, Living Better Together the African Way. And the last name of the author is spelled Ngomane. Ubuntu refutes the notion that a person can ever be self-made, because we are all interconnected. We should not be fooled by the myth of the self-made individual, as no one exists in true isolation. And this quote seems so fitting for, I think it is a myth, that when we have an online presence and as we are moving more and more to digital communication, one-on-one and in groups, and relying on social media, emails, texting, and even phone calls, that it's we're not having the in-person experiences as much as we were before. So as someone who spends so much time building an digital business online, what are your thoughts about this, Tanya?
Well, first of all, thanks for suggesting this topic today. You were inspired around this, and I think nothing could be more timely. We're still in the age of COVID as we're recording this in early June 2020. And right now, people are in the streets, Black Lives Matters, the whole culture is in an enormous moment of change. And I have been online pretty seriously for 10 years. I was an early adopter with a website 20 years ago, 19 actually, but really started selling online about 11 years ago, and have gone deep dives into all the social media, and was attracted to it immediately because what I saw in it was the possibility of what has come to exist, to be in touch with a global web of people. So, first of all, I so love the piece about community and that none of us are self-made, and the illusion that someone is self-made can really be perpetuated and kind of in a very exploitative way online. It's a kind of, I think about, the guru paradigm, and this image of the self-made individual online is actually, I think, something that is shifting and breaking apart at this time. So if we were in like early childhood online for the last however many years, it feels to me like we're moving into some kind of an adolescence, some kind of a shift, or I don't even want to say adolescence, but there's movement, there's maturity happening. And one of the things of this time is that it is about community, that it takes many of us, as you and I have talked about a lot lately, about diversity on the outer and diversity on the inner, and that it takes many skill sets and many gifts and many talents and many life experiences to create anything truly meaningful. But I think the thing that I'm noticing in the digital space right now is those that have set themselves up as gurus and not really acknowledging the tremendous amount of energy and beingness and experience supporting them in that are the ones crashing and burning right now. There's a shift happening developmentally, for sure, in the entrepreneurial space, in the online coaching and teaching and facilitation space. And personally, I'm excited about it because it's becoming the opportunities to become more relational and to show the relationships and lead with the relationships rather than with that sort of very patriarchal image of I'm this soul, often white person doing it on my own. So
from a systemic relational standpoint, if that's such a potent image, when you say somebody crashed and burned, as a system, how do we hold people? Like how would you see holding the people that are crashing and burning? Because we're a closed container species, right? And on a closed container planet, and what happens to one person impacts everyone else, right? In some way.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I'm seeing so much love and compassion happening now and activism. So I'm part of 3 different groups online that are they're specifically white spaces, not segregated spaces, but white spaces where there's accountability with Black people and or other people of color, for us to decolonize ourselves, decondition ourselves from the sickness that is white supremacy, that just like patriarchy and capitalism has been the water we've been swimming in. So the problems are the unconsciousness. So what I'm seeing is people are being challenged. They're being challenged in their power. They're also being called in as much as they're being called out. So right now, I've never seen resources like this. And I want to say, maybe that's my own bias that led with sharing about the white spaces. There's so many Black educators online now teaching white people, people like Rachel Cargill, who's been really big in the online space, breaking this apart. Layla Syed, who wrote Me and White Supremacy. There's so many resources. The Black literary canon, I mean, stuff like James Baldwin and his work and Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, like stuff now and stuff that's more historical. Toni Morrison, it's being shared. There's so many resources available for us to do our work. And so my feeling is the people that are kind of crashing and burning because they were riding in an unconscious way and only centering themselves. It's not even just whiteness alone. It's this kind of entitlement, this kind of elitism, and this kind of guru thing. Because I've seen it in spiritual circles. It happens in educational, other institutional circles. It's like it's elitist and it's lone wolf, right? It's a kind of I'm better than everyone. It's elevated, and of course that goes with a white supremacist narrative, or male supremacist narrative and patriarchy. So. People are reaching out. Those people are being called out, but also called in. There is so much community support for people who want to shift and change. Rachel Rogers, who's an incredible entrepreneur, and she's having a town hall calling people in to reimagine business. So I think if anybody who's willing to be humble and come in from a space of I don't know. And I make mistakes all the time. And I'm saying that for myself. I make mistakes. I'm no expert on this. I've been committed to social justice for a long time. I've made so many mistakes and some public mistakes. And the thing is, though, not collapsing into our fragility. So the practice becomes, I'm making mistakes, but I'm living out loud. And my heart is here. Teach me. I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to do the work. So for the crash and burn people, it's like, sometimes some of the more well-known people who have gone down or, their businesses, I think, will be impacted forever. And this happened with I'm thinking of a couple women right now that happened to recently, but I saw this happen with men, including like Tony Robbins and the Me Too movement. And there was a conflict with this woman and, all kinds of things. I think how people survive is going to be, are you willing to go low? Are you willing to say, I don't know? I've been unconscious. This conditioning, because you do family ancestral constellation work, is not just me. This is centuries and centuries, and maybe all the way back to millennium of unconscious conditioning. So how do we go low and stay open and stay in inquiry? And for me, my practice is to be listening to Black women and learning from Black women right now.
It's interesting. I think part of my practice is, I have this background in teaching emotional intelligence, mm-hmm. especially in healthcare. And, one of the big things, that I learned is that if you have a difficult issue, you just don't do it on social media. You don't confront on social media. You don't even do it in a text. If it has to do with a sensitive topic or it could impact a relationship, you mm-hmm. pick up the phone mm-hmm. because we are just more relational when we can hear the intonations in a voice than, there's just so much lost in the visual, digital communication realm. And I think one of the ways that I've been working with it is that when I see someone actually doing that, mm-hmm. engaging in edgy, sort of confrontational, trying to work out relationship stuff through email or texting without picking up the phone or being able to meet in person, is I think it's actually a way that they're trying to get closer. It pushes us away, but this is what I have learned so much in my constellation work, is that these movements in the relational field oftentimes look opposite of what the inner desire is. The inner longing may be to come closer. And so what do? We start to kind of maybe engage in some dissonant behavior mm-hmm. to create some dissonance, because at least that's intimate, right? It's relational.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I've created some dissonant behavior like that. I've done that online. I've called people out. I have to say, in the case, I always go to people behind the scenes first. And I do try and have phone conversations or ask for, can we clear the air? Because I think that's the thing. We can't be afraid of that. It's so essential that we go privately first. With my own personal business coach, who is one of the people who, I think has had her business impacted negatively in this time. And hopefully she'll learn from that and, take the invitation that's been given her. But here's the thing. It's a paradigm. So when people set themselves up as a guru, I asked to speak with her, with a friend of mine last fall, and she didn't allow it. So what happened when all of this came down? It goes out online when people haven't been available for the relational thing. And there is a whole very patriarchal way of, quote unquote, leveraging a business. It's very accepted in the entrepreneurial way. And the way a lot of people do it is to pass everything off to their team so that they can remain removed as a rock star. But they're not a rock star. They're a teacher. They're a coach. And then there's no intimacy with your teacher or coach. It's so big. It's such an enterprise. And I've thought for decades this is problematic in any kind of setup for real teaching, learning. The intimacy is lost. So when does something become too big? To me, I can't even imagine wanting a business where one of my students, I couldn't make time for a 20-minute call to clear the air about something. To me, then it's jump the shark, right? It's like the desire for greed and so much money and the promise multiple six figures, not just six figures, but multiple six figures, 7 figures, 8 figures, is very much about moving away from intimacy with clients. And I'm speaking very much, but in the thing you and I both do, we teach clients. I work with people in Story. You do constellations. We do work together. We do work with other people. And it's not so big You know what I'm saying? That's why that stuff happens online, I think. I mean, many reasons for those things to happen, but that's one of the reasons is the person has set themselves so far apart that they're not available for a phone call, even if you reach out to them, or a short talk.
And this is really, you're speaking from the entrepreneurial world. And I can also say that this happens in healthcare. It happens around policy and politics, and I do think that this is one of the skills of the new leadership paradigm.
Yes.
It's really how to help people become more relational and how to lean in and to recognize some of these compensations.
Yeah.
As a reach for intimacy, so that we don't personalize everything in a way that we're all then reacting and bumping up against each other. I had an interesting thing happen the other day, and I actually have to say I was pretty proud of myself because it was a reframe of a trigger. So I grew up in a very small town, and there were 200 people in the town. There were 14 kids in my graduating class. There were I think, kindergarten through 12th grade, we were all under the same roof, 200 in the whole school. I mean, it was really, it was more than 200 people including the outlying areas, but I grew up in a tiny little town. So you can imagine, part of what happens in those towns is, I think it's like it bumps up against the need for differentiation and intimacy. Like, how do we differentiate and how do we come together? And I think then it can become sort of messy, and those two processes can overlap in ways that creates hardship, right? So one of the ways that happens is through sort of the gossip chain in a small town,
yes, sure.
Right? You don't experience the gossip chain in the same way in a large city. There are just so many people. But I'm back now in Oregon for a time, not in the town I grew up, but in a town close by. It's relatively small. My family is known here. And I went into a public place the other day, and I saw someone who knows me, and I could tell she was really trying to get the dirt on my life. Like she really, but she did it in a way that was like really like prying, and it was pretty inappropriate relationally. It just, I sort of felt violated. And because of my upbringing, that sort of felt like a trigger. But you know what? I walked away and I thought, you know what? That's care gone sideways. She, there was she wants to connect with me.
Right.
She's wanting intimacy.
Totally.
And this is really the only way that she knows how to do that right now. Because when you gossip, it can feel intimate in the moment. It can feel like connection, a form of connection, but it doesn't call you to be vulnerable.
Right.
Because gossip is all about the other.
Totally.
And so I think we are living in this culture of othering, and I think that othering is what's concerning me about how we will restory the digital culture, because I think there are parts of our biology and our neurology that are being challenged and hopefully not atrophying. But sometimes that's an image that comes up for me, is that with all the ways that our brains are responding to different ways of communicating, I almost think it's easier to other, because we can send someone a text and get a reply, and we didn't see the look of grief on their face.
Yes, yes.
You know what I mean? We didn't hear the tone in their voice that told us they were vulnerable. I mean, one thing that happened with this person who I recently had an experience with around gossip was that helped me to bridge what maybe she really was reaching for intimacy, and it was coming across as gossip, right?
Yeah.
Was that I actually kind of saw the desperation with this person. She was desperate. She was leaning toward me. She wanted something. It felt inappropriate, and it felt a bit like a violation, but I also know that I have a sensitivity to that because of how I grew up. And it felt so good to actually feel like I could sort of bring her closer to my own heart and to feel some compassion for her in a way.
Totally. And I think with emotional intelligence, I feel like people are practicing that more online. So there was one woman yesterday in a new group I'm in, and it's around people sort of looking at their privilege, and it can be very charged, right? There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of fragility, there's a lot of fear and terror about saying the wrong things. Shame can get triggered. I mean, it's not a safe space. It's a brave space, but not a safe space. And even with conscious intention. And she was a little bit, I felt like in a comment, stepping on my toes. And I didn't respond. And then she threw in an extra response, and this changed everything for me. She said, I just want to let everyone know in the space that I'm autistic. And so sometimes I come across in a way where it appears that I'm cold, and I don't feel that way, but I come off as cold. And in response, I said, I'm so grateful you shared that. I'm a bit ADHD myself, and I'm really an introvert. And I said, but with the ADHD, my brain can be moving so fast that I can come across as dismissive. And then she said, thank you so much for sharing that. And she said, we can have space here for disabilities too and differences. Now, nobody's ever used the word about my ADHD disability, but I suffer from it privately a lot. And it just brought tears to my eyes. And then I wrote back and I said, when you use that phrase, it just brought tears to my eyes and let me have more compassion for myself. So what I want to say is, we bonded through the ethers and we've never seen each other's face. I have a profile picture. She doesn't. So she's seen my face digitally. But what I realized was, and I've had this certainly on Zoom calls a lot with people, I think our brains are changing and we're adapting as a species. And if we use our language, if we use language from the heart and slow down long enough to move past what we're trying so hard to be heard about, or like make our point, and remember to bring that emotional language in. She was vulnerable first when she shared about being autistic and how she was perceived, and it was the perfect thing to say to open me right up. I thought, my God, I don't know this woman, but we just had this beautiful, authentic exchange. It really did bring a tear right there to me. Nobody'd ever said that to me in my quote unquote real life.
It's a great example. It's a beautiful story. And I have to admit, I know people sort of make fun of emojis, but I do think emojis were created probably for that reason, because not everything can be conveyed even in language, typed language. Mm-hmm. But so to see an emoji, it's like someone saying, here's my intention. I'm saying this.
Totally.
But I'm saying it with love, and it really
it's a shorthand.
Well, and it's also a symbol, and the brain responds differently to a symbol than it does to written language.
Completely.
And I think it's really an interesting thing to think about. As was kind of listening to you, I also had this image of, wouldn't it be wonderful if every time we had to send a digital message, we actually had to do an emotional check-in, mm-hmm. so that prior to the message being sent, we used symbolic language or color or something that would let people know where we were in the moment that didn't have anything to do with them. So if somebody's grieving, right, prior to reading their written message, that they're in this place as they're sending it. Or somebody may be feeling, particularly expansive as they're writing something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the stuff in a way that we're missing, because that's a lot of stuff.
But it's a time of tremendous innovation. As you said that, I thought as soon as you say that, it's already manifesting somewhere. We'll be doing that. We will be doing that. People are already... one of the things I'm asking for all my groups now is to insist that everybody show their face. We don't have to have makeup on. You can be in your bathrobe. I don't care. But like having some people show their face and others not, it doesn't lead to intimacy. Totally. Leaning into the conversation, being up close and having your face in rather than be like super pulled back, and I see it from other cohorts I've been in and what works and what doesn't, and with my students and all. And it's like taking conscious breaks, but it's a conscious break so that then when you're in the group that, there's presence, getting up and stretching, whatever, but these emotional things you're talking about, It's part of our work right now, especially as facilitators. You and I are both coaches and facilitators, and we work intimately with people online to help them do things. This is part of our work, to figure out how to create intimacy in the online space. Does it replace real life? No. It's a different experience, though. And how can we make it, in some ways, what if it has, I know it has gifts, right? We know it has gifts that the real life space doesn't. So that they both have gifts, they both have a place. But during this time of COVID in particular, we've been given this offering with everyone at home for so long to take this as an inquiry like we're having now and to innovate around it.
Yeah, and I just want to say, before we kind of wrap up the conversation, I think if there's anything I would suggest based on my experience and what I've read through research and what I've learned is that if it's sensitive, pick up the phone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And be available. And for people online to stay available. I reach out now to people who are just Facebook friends for conversations, and it's great. And sometimes it's not even a sensitive thing. It's just like, wow, we really have a resonance. Why don't we have a phone call? I just did this with this coach who we've been Facebook friends for 5 years. We like each other a lot. And I was like, could we just talk? And she's like, I've been thinking of that for so long. Let's do it. So that it's not even about the problem, right? But to take the connection offline when we can.
Well, and I just sold a house, and it was, one of the people that I was interfacing with a lot is a millennial. Mm-hmm. And it was like, I've never experienced anything like that, trying to do an entire real estate transaction primarily on text. Mm-hmm. And that really it was actually really hard for me. I really thought this just doesn't feel right. There's a lot of emotion and a lot of personal stuff, behind selling a property, behind turning something, that you've loved and you've lived in from one person to another. And I thought, I think that's, I guess, I am, we are old enough now that we can start kind of doing our elderhood stuff. Mm-hmm. And I want to be really careful that I don't generalize, the generations. Mm-hmm. With that said, I think I do have a concern for the millennials. And I guess I wonder what they would say, because I do see an increase in trying to navigate big relationship issues through email and text. And I think, that's a concern to me.
And I think, my intuition around this is, and different people and different younger people, including a woman who's worked for me, and I see her returning to the older ways. She and her husband, and they're millennials. They live in Brooklyn. They're very into like cooking clubs and sort of doing things even very retro. And like they have these there is a return. My feeling about this is people will navigate it.
But that's different. That's different.
Right, than just navigating stuff in the online space.
I'm just talking about digital communication.
Yeah. I think that, though, people will find the limitations in it. We all do. And then we all have to sort of crash and burn, right, in our way, and what does it and doesn't work around that. But and I have a lot of faith, too, in some of the younger generations. I know they know stuff we don't know, and they're going to figure out their intimacy stuff around it, because, of course, there's always consequences for taking anything too far.
I think those are the two things that I'm curious about with the future generations, have to do with intimacy and, I think it's about intimacy. I'm curious to know how we are evolving as a species in that way. And that's another podcast.
That's another podcast. We have a lot to say about that, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, if I say what I'm really thinking right now, we'll go another hour. So.
I know what I was going to say. It's right. It's intimacy and instinct. Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about how intimacy and instinct are evolving in the human species. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I wonder, how is our instinct impacted when we're not in person so much? I've talked about this before on this podcast, but it was a it was something I read in some research that kind of blew my mind, that when we're in a state of grief,
Yeah.
we emit an undetectable scent. And so, I mean, we are human animals. We are biology, right? And our biology is also an incredible metaphor. And I think we're moving away from our biology. Like that's like the digital is going to,
Take over. I mean, it is for now anyway. And then for me as a story person, storyteller, story coach, it makes me realize that languaging our emotions is going to be more important than ever. Like actually...
And to stretch into vulnerability.
And to stretch into vulnerability and stretch the way we language things, or even what we're used to languaging. Take another step for the sake of the relational field. Right.
Being curious, listening, working on not taking things personally, asking more questions, and leaning in instead of pulling back. I think it's easy to pull back and create distance and to other.
Emotional intelligence for the digital age is going to be slightly different than just emotional intelligence.
It is, absolutely.
So how can you and I, it makes me think we need an offline conversation, and how can we integrate it even more into our groups and work on teaching it, because, this is the calling for now.
I agree with you. That's a great place for us to start wrapping up.
Yeah.
Thanks for the wonderful conversation.
Always, Camille.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restorying the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restorying the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.